Open the regular meeting of the Planning Commission for Tuesday, August 10th, 2021. I'll open the meeting at 7:30. And so therefore the meeting is called to order. May we please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Wow, in unison.
Zoom version. Let's do roll call, if I may.
August should be on his way right now, and he's here, so if we want to
There he is, okay.
swear Mr. Fitzer first.
We'll have our city clerk do the swearing in of the new member.
Where do I go? Right here.
Oh, come on down. I'm sorry, I don't have my red, white, and blue swearing-in shoes on today. I forgot about that last time, so. Okay.
I've decided to take a picture, is that okay?
Sure. Of the United States.
I will support the Constitution of the United States,
The Constitution of this state.
the Constitution of this state,
The Charter of the City of Clawson.
the Charter of the City of Clawson,
And that I will faithfully perform the duties
and I will faithfully perform the duties
of the Office of Planning Commissioner
of the Office of Planning Commissioner
in and for the City of Clawson,
in and for the City of Clawson,
County of Oakland,
County of Oakland,
State of Michigan,
State of Michigan,
according to the best of my ability.
according to the best of my ability. Thank you.
Glad to have you. John Hancock here in 2 spots. One there, one there.
Speech.
I'll sign you here.
I want to thank all you guys for volunteering your time to do this. If without you guys, we couldn't have a sit down.
Oh,
I didn't know this was volunteer. I thought we were getting paid.
You've been waiting a long time. For
A long time.
Yeah, how many years you been doing
It's
this?
accumulating. I'm going to retire on.
Checks in the mail.
Okay, now that we have a new member sworn in, welcome to the group, and may I have roll call now, please?
Mr. Kucera,
Here.
Mr. McHale,
here.
Mr. Nushai,
Here.
Mr. Pernick,
Here.
Ms. Redmond,
Here.
Mr. Sinaki,
Here.
Mr. Watson,
Yes.
and for the first time, Mr. Fitzer.
Here.
Very good, thank you. Rennis is here, so would you prefer to do the election of officers early on or later on? What's your preference?
With your good evening, everyone, and Mr. Fitzer, welcome, and good evening, everyone, and the other Mr. Nushai, which I hadn't seen prior to today in this meeting. With your permission, Mr. Kucera, I would hope that we could do the election of the officers now, since we have an ongoing meeting.
Okay, you're not
next
done
door.
with that one?
Yeah, we're not done with that one, unfortunately. The city attorney is the parliamentarian, which is a very fancy word of saying that I will assist you, even though you will need no assistance, in selecting your hopefully it's working. Oh, I'm a little too tall. There you go. I'll speak low. I will assist you with the selection of your chair position. Obviously, the chairperson being appointed to council, having resigned this, there's a vacancy. I believe we do have a vice chair, if I remember correctly, though, and I think that may be Mr.
I'm
Kucera.
for vice chair.
Preside. So the Open Meetings Act dictates obviously how we do this, which is a little strange in many respects in that we don't do secret ballots or anything of that nature. We basically have an ongoing, an open conversation about whom we may want to elect. So I imagine you would elicit, or any one of you is able to propose whom you wish, or may propose themselves. That's also obviously acceptable. And whomever has the necessary votes, being that we do have quorum, would be elected chair.
I'd like to nominate Craig Kucera to take the chair, please.
I'll second that.
Motion, support. Any discussion?
I think that Greg would be great in this position. Greg was in the position previously, and I think he did a great job. I really like how he runs meetings. I just think he'd be a good asset. I think he's the strongest person on this board to do it.
Thank you.
Took the words right out of my mouth.
I did. I read your script.
I think we should ask Mr. Casera if he wants to accept the nomination. Because if he has a different perspective of his position, then that would be nice to know.
I've been in both seats, and my preference would be to be vice chair. It's a better, more comfortable seat than it is to be chair, but I will accept the nomination. So maybe we have a roll call on that, please.
Mr. McHale?
Yes.
Mr. Nushai?
No.
Mr. Pernick?
Yes.
Ms. Redmond?
Yes.
Mr. Sinaki?
Yes.
Mr. Watson?
Yes.
Mr. Fitzer?
Yes.
Motion carries. Oh, and Mr. Casera, my apologies, I missed you.
Yes.
There you go, motion carries.
Okay, then we need a motion to who wants to take the office of vice chair.
Correct.
Do we have any nominees or any volunteers? It's an easy job. Aaron can't because you're staying secretary, right?
I guess I haven't thought too much about that. In your absence, I know I'd be a little nervous to run the meetings. That's my only concern, yeah.
So we need someone to,
I'd like to ask Mr. Watson if he'd like to accept the nomination.
Nomination for vice chair?
Yes, sir.
I mean, I think I
Is
could-
that the
I think I
position
could do
that comes with a
position.
monetary compensation that he was asking for?
Yeah.
That's up to other people, not
There you
me.
go. Just making sure.
Yeah, I think I could fill that position. I was offered a position on the board, an elected position previously, but I did decline simply because of time factors and what I had going on. But I think with my time now, I think I could be open for that position, absolutely.
okay, I'll second the motion then, and can we do roll call, please?
Mr. Nushai?
Yes.
Mr. Pernick?
Yes.
Ms. Redmond?
Yes.
Mr. Sinaki?
Yes.
Mr. Watson?
Yes.
Mr. Fitzer?
Yes.
Mr. Casera?
Yes,
And Mr. McHale?
Yes.
Motion carries.
very good, thank you. And Aaron stays on as.
Aaron stands on
secretary.
as the secretary. Thank
Okay.
you. Congratulations, Mr. Casera. Congratulations, Mr. Watson. Congratulations, Aaron. Thank you very much for your courtesy.
Thank you.
Have a good
Thank you.
meeting.
Will we see you later in the meeting? For
Once I'm done over there, I'll swing by. I know that some questions may arise based on our last conversation that we had here, so hopefully it all works just perfect.
Very good,
Thank you very much, everyone.
thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, now I'll entertain a motion to approve the regular minute meetings from July 13th, 2021.
I think we got to make a slight amendment on that one.
Okay,
And that would reflect on the last page of the proposal, in that it says that Councilman Shepherd was absent. So if he was absent, he couldn't have voted on the other things in there. So I just would like to see that removed as far as him being absent, because he was here at that meeting.
yes, he was, he actually ran the meeting, so, yeah. So let's remove his name from the absent column. Okay, will you approve it with that change?
So I'd like him to make a proposal that we approve the amended regular meeting minutes from July 13th, 2021 of the Planning Commission.
Support.
Yeah, I have a motion, I have support. Roll call, please.
Ms. Redmond?
Yes.
Mr. Sinaki?
Yes.
Mr. Watson?
Yes.
Mr. Fitzer?
Yes.
Mr. Casera?
Yes.
Mr. McHale?
Yes.
Mr. Nushai?
Yes.
And Mr. Pernick?
Yes.
Motion carries. And I would like to add that the minute software that we're using, we're in the process of changing it, so your next minutes may look a little bit different, so if you guys have any recommendations when they come in, I would be pleased to take them as well. So, thank you.
Yeah, some of these I think are just a cut and paste mistake that got carried over from something else. Yeah, okay, very good. Minutes are approved. We're on agenda item number 5 is public discussion, items not on the agenda. Does anyone here in the public have anything to say or We can open up to the people at home if we have, what, 4 people? And you see anybody raising their hand, Ken? Apparently no one asking any questions for public. Okay, in that case, I'll close public discussion. And we'll move on to agenda item number 6 is public hearing, amendments to the zoning ordinance to provide standards for these establishments and permit them in the B3 district. This is the smoking establishments, I believe, isn't it? Is it not? Joe, you want to open us up on this one?
I'm not as tall as Rennis. All right, so yes, this was discussed 2 meetings ago, as is the rhythm of noticing for hearings. So what we're doing with these amendments is we're establishing a definition for on-premises smoking establishment. We are noting that that is permitted subject to special approval in the B3 district, and we're providing 2 standards for that use. And I will put them up on screen so that we can all see what the text is. So I'm gonna just gotta maneuver to where I can share my screen here. Right there. Hopefully people can basically read that. So we've defined smoking establishment. I have to get this out of here. As an establishment where tobacco products are sold for use or consumption on the premises to persons age 18 or older, as provided by state law, and we've said what it includes. And we've also noted that this doesn't include cannabis establishments or cannabis-related establishments. It's a special approval use in the B3 district, and these 2 standards apply. Any application for the establishment of an on-premises smoking establishment shall include documentary evidence that the proprietor of the establishment has obtained an exemption permitting the on-site consumption of tobacco products, and the establishment shall be operated in strict accordance with the requirements of state of Michigan law. Very basic requirements, but we definitely need to have a record of that if we're approving one of these, because as we discussed last time, there is a very limited number of exemptions from the prohibition on smoking indoors on public places, and they kind of sell a little bit like liquor licenses, so it's a little hard to get your hands on them, but we need to know that if we're actually permitting this use, you actually have the exemption. And just as a little refresher, the thing that got us thinking about this was the fact that we've had a number of people ask about the use over the last really 2 years. I think we've had about 5 inquiries about it. And we don't have anything in the zoning ordinance saying where it goes. So that's what this establishes. It says it goes in the B3 district, and here's what you have to show us in order to have one of these uses. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Yeah, I think we hashed this out pretty well, and we moved them down to B3 is the only place that will allow them to try it. And I think everybody seemed to be satisfied with that. Does anybody have any further comments or questions on it?
I have one question.
Sure.
And I know it's all been hashed out, so I'm not trying to reopen anything. As far as, and I'm not sure, the similarity to liquor licenses is a good way to look at it. does the exemption travel with the license? So if someone, one retailer sells it to another, or do they have to apply for that exemption again?
If a retailer sells it to another retailer, the retailer who sold it no longer has the ability to do the on-premises smoking use.
Okay.
And the new user would have that. So if you were to, let's say, like a parent passed a business to a child, they would have to also pass the license or the permit, the exemption on to the child in order for the use to continue.
So a new place opens, a new hookah bar opens, and would they have to chase down the exemption? They buy the license, but then they don't get the exemption.
Yeah, you have to show us you have the exemption in order to do the use. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm pleased with the rewriting of the ordinance and actually getting it in place, because we've never had anything like this before. I don't see it being a big problem. I don't think there's going to be a lot of businesses that are going to run into town here and open up hookah bars and smoking. It could be a few might try it, but at least now we have an ordinance where they can do that.
Right.
So I'm pleased with it. I see this is listed as a public hearing, though. Do we have to open this to the?
We do. We have to take public comment on the amendment.
Okay, so there's no other questions from the panel. I will open up for public hearing. If anyone has any, from the public has any comments about opening smoking areas in the city of Clawson. And Ken will see if anybody's raising their hands there. What do we have for? No comment? I didn't think there'd be much public comment on that. Okay, in that case, I'll close public comment. And do we need to do anything with that? We just, do you need a motion to send it on to?
Yes,
Council?
you need a motion to recommend adoption of the amendment to City Council.
So I would entertain a motion to that effect.
I'll make a motion that we recommend to City Council the proposed ordinance language relating to on-site smoking establishments.
I'll support that.
Motion, support. Any comments? Seeing none, roll call, please.
Mr. Watson?
Yes.
Mr. Fitzer?
Yes.
Mr. Cusero?
Yes.
Mr. McHale?
Yes.
Mr. Nushai?
Yes.
Mr. Pernick?
Yes.
Ms. Redmond?
Yes.
And Mr. Sinaki?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Very good, thank you.
Before we move on, I just wanted to note, there was a public hearing scheduled on building materials for the 27th, the meeting on the 27th.
Right.
That's been rescheduled for August 24th because there was no meeting on the 27th. So that public hearing will be next time. I just wanted y'all to know, if you were keeping track in your head of the stuff we've got going on, that one's going to be next time because we couldn't make the noticing deadline for this meeting. So,
That's the approving of the building materials you used in?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just as a public service announcement too, it was posted in the Oakland Press, dated the 6th of August. So if anybody's looking, that was on page B7 of the Oakland Press.
Okay. And we'll move on to agenda item number 7, which is consideration of the proposed amendment to approve site plan at 424-444 Elliott, which is Elliott Park Apartments. You want to walk us through this one, Joel?
Yep. Okay, so it's a little awkward for me to go through my letter and also show stuff on the screen. So I'm going to go through my letter and then show stuff on the screen. That'll be I think, the smoothest way to do it. So, those of you who were on The Planning Commission at the time will recall that last year we approved an apartment building at 424 North Rochester. And if you've driven by, you've seen it going up. It's well underway. And they are asking us to approve some modifications to the design of the building. That as they were building the building, it became clear to them that this was a better way to handle it than the way they had originally proposed to handle it. So that site plan was approved almost exactly a year ago, July 28th, 2020. And at the time, there were also a couple of variances approved to make the project possible. There's a right-of-way to the north that was never built as a street, and that factored into the granting of these two variances. One was that there was a 10-foot north setback approved to that right-of-way line. And then the other one was that there was a density variance to allow up to 58 rooms on the site. If you're not familiar, when we do a multifamily development, our zoning ordinance doesn't really look at units when it's calculating density. It looks at rooms in the units. So an efficiency unit is one room, and a one-bedroom unit is two rooms, and a two-bedroom unit. So that's how we come up with a density number. And 58 rooms was what was permitted on this site. So the amendments to the site plan only affect the building. The layout of the surrounding site is not changed at all. So the letter really focuses on the building itself and the changes that are being proposed. And there are a couple of very minor things that are on here too that I'll verbally address them. So there's a portion of the building that houses a shared fitness facility, and it is kind of sticks out on the south side of the building. The building's kind of an L shape, and it sticks out of that foot of the L. And originally, that was proposed to be one story with a little like roof deck on top of it for people to hang out on. And what they've done is they've eliminated that roof deck, and they've added a second story. And what that second story did was it enlarged the unit adjacent, which is an efficiency unit. And they actually reconfigured the floor plan, as you can see, of the unit so that basically it's a bigger bedroom than it would have had before, or a bigger sleeping area than it would have had before. But they didn't change the number of rooms in the unit when they did that. And then, let's see. The other one is that the dormers on the north side of the building have been kind of changed. That's shown on page 4 of the letter. So they originally had kind of two separate dormers between the peaked dormers, and they had two different elevations for the dormers. So there were these two little ones with peaked roofs, and then two little ones with kind of more like hipped roofs. And what they've done is it's still set back the same distance that it was originally from the continuous eave line that goes along the north side of the building, but they've kind of filled it in. Instead of separate dormers, it's two dormers that really kind of abut and make a continuous dormer. And I'll let them explain why they're doing that, but I know that part of the reason that they gave me for that was that they were looking at snow falling on the roof and how it was going to be collected by the individual dormers, and flattening out those dormers into a single roof line between the little peaks captures a lot less snow. So that was one of the reasons that they gave for doing that. It adds a little bit of square footage to the loft room of each of those units. It's basically it makes it a slightly larger room, basically. And then there's a couple other minor changes, like the staircases have just been redesigned a little bit, but they're in the same exact place. And then the roof that comes down over the area where the staircases are has been extended out a little bit, so the eave is lower, which basically is meant to capture more rain that would go into the staircase and get on the people who are using the stairs. And it just comes down a little further, like 2 or 3 feet further. So those are the changes, and I'm going to put them up on the screen now so that everybody can share in viewing them.
And they seem rather minor in that you're not changing the size, shape of the building, the number of units in it, parking lots is going to remain the same. This is something that automatically comes back to us from site plan rather than administration taking care of it?
It does. This is the kind of thing that was sort of a borderline, like, is this administrative review? Is this coming back to the planning commission? And basically, it was determined internally that because the elevations are part of the approved site plan, it comes back here. Particularly that second story is a change to the elevation. So that's really what we're looking at. What we found in our review is that it still meets the standards of, in this case, it's the standards of the zoning ordinance and the conditions of the zoning board of appeals variances that were granted. Normally, we look at the standards of the zoning ordinance. Does it meet the standards of the zoning ordinance? If it does, we approve it. In this case, it meets the standards of the zoning ordinance and it meets the variant. It's compliant with the 2 variances that were granted. So.
And can you tell us what the 2 variants were granted by the zoning board?
Yeah, that was the 10-foot north setback and the 58 rooms permitted on the site.
Okay.
So let me throw that up there. Okay, here it is. So here's the layout of the site. There it is. Like I said, that has not changed. The site looks exactly the same. The fitness center was always connected by a deck above. It looks kind of separate here because they're showing the ground level. There was a little pass through there originally. Here's the dormers. So you've had these kind of 2 little dormers, and it's still set back the same amount from where the outer wall is and this eave is, but it's this, like, instead of these little dormers in 2 different configurations, it's one configuration in all the gaps between the little peaks.
Joe, can I ask
Yeah.
how many feet is that?
Feet from.
Part of the
here to
reason
here?
why they propose, I know a lot of times the dormers is for an ease of transition into a residential area. And I don't know if that was part of the reason why they configured it this way, and that came into acceptance for those reasons, right? So I'm wondering how much more, how high the roof is gonna be, because typically it's, set based on below the dormers, not necessarily at or.
Right, yeah. So this doesn't really significantly change the overall roof line of the building. The building still has a continuous eave along the north facade. And then when you get to the edges, and I can actually open up the plans to show you this because I've got the full plans here. But basically the roof is hipped at the ends, at both ends of the north facade. And the dormers stop before you get to the roof hip. So the overall profile of the building, particularly from other angles and not the north, has not changed at all. It's just where the dormers actually are that has changed. Let me. No, that's not what I wanted. So. Okay, this shows it. I gotta zoom in. southern elevation, sorry. Getting to the right elevation here. Okay. So, I'm going to switch my share. Come on. I got to toggle back and forth between so many things here. Okay, come on. Oh, there we go. You share.
Yeah, those drawings are sent separately from the rest of the package, so
Should be showing up there. There we go.
makes it a little harder to find.
So what's kind of hidden behind that stack of little videos there. But you can see how the roof line comes down here to the hip and then continues over on the eave here. So they haven't changed the overall roof line. It's still got dormers coming down to the same place. They're just filling in this gap rather than two separate little dormers in that gap. And that's really what the change is.
Joe, can I ask you a question? So what's your take on these changes? What is your feeling? Is it seem like something that's relatively simple enough that it shouldn't really make a difference?
Yes, yeah, I would say it's a pretty simple change, and it doesn't really make that much of a difference to the overall shape of the building. And it's also, I mean, the important thing is it compliant with the ordinance and the variances that were granted? And it is compliant with the ordinance and the variances that were granted. So, I mean, that's really the standard that we measure it by. I do think it's minor changes, and it is compliant with the ordinance and the variances that were granted, so.
Okay.
If I could throw an opinion in there too, looking at the plans with what they did with this new proposal, it's more, I'll say, curb appeal on that is more continuity in eliminating those caps that they had up on the roof. Because just looking at the designs, the height of the roof didn't change, but the continuity of the building itself was more curb appeal. That's my impression.
Sure.
And I've got 11 by 17 drawings.
You're the only one that has those.
Hey, we got to discuss that at the end of the meeting. I want to
Yeah.
make sure everybody's getting what they want. I know some of you are comfortable working with the digital stuff, but others would prefer to have stuff on paper. So I want to make sure we have a definitive list of who gets paper and who doesn't. There's the other change. So you can see before they had this roof line coming out here, and there was this little deck here. And it was kind of like a hangout area, I guess. And they've eliminated the hangout area, and they've added this second story above with a roof. And they've kept the curved design of the facade. The roof line went a little higher than the floor of the second floor here, so they've added, it's really the height of the windows that's been added to the facade, and then you get the roof above. But this building overall is a fair amount taller than just this portion of it, and this portion, of course, meets the height limit of the district. And then there's how the floor plan changed. They originally had this bedroom here, and that's been eliminated, and this is now the sleeping area of the unit over here. So, I guess I'll throw it back there for the moment. You can see that setback that was proposed, because there really is nothing ever going to be built here. That was kind of the rationale for that. Any questions, comments for me before we let the applicant say however much he's going to say?
Joe, just to clarify on the that second story change.
Sure.
You said that new enclosed space is now the sleeping area, and
Yeah.
the original one is no longer the sleeping area?
Yeah, they've eliminated the walls that separated it, and I don't know exactly what the space is going to be, but you can speak to that, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not separated from the rest of the unit.
Got it. And because we're just moving or reassigning the sleeping space, we haven't changed the density.
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
If there's no more questions for Joe, would the applicant like to make any comments?
I'll just keep this up in case we gotta look at something.
Great.
Thank you for the opportunity and privilege to be here. My name's Anthony Randazzo, and I'd like to share some of the exciting things that have gone on with this building. I hope you've had the opportunity to drive by and see some of the wonderful designs we've done. We put the brickwork with the box weave up in the front. In addition to that, we decided to add a little more brick and stone because we think it's very attractive and it's going to be a legacy asset. That's just cosmetic. However, the dormers that Ms. Redmond brought up, there's a logic behind that. Mr. Rule, he's the constructor of it, he said, I can make things safer. So what that meant in English, and rather than have a very steep pitch roof, which they refer to them by 12s, it had an 8-12 pitch, which is not walkable. He, in his wisdom, decided to square off those dormers, not go higher, just square them off so that if there were an unfortunate circumstance of a fire, you'd have the ability to step out, and it's like a 3-12 pitch. So it's substantially more safe. Things happen. Although this building is suppressed, you never know. But you can actually walk out there. Any one of us, even if you're afraid of heights, you'd stand on it. It's almost like a deck. So that was of paramount importance to me. So when he suggested the change, I didn't quite visually understand it. I said, as long as we, run it by the city and it's safer, makes sense, provided we respect the privilege of receiving the variances that you so graciously gave us. So that ended that discussion. In reference to the fitness center, they brought up, I'm very sensitive to neighbors because, I've come to enough of these meetings that it's very difficult for you folks to make decisions to make everybody happy, and I understand that. So when he suggested that there's an opportunity to privatize that unit and not have that deck that was open to the south and kind of orient it kind of to the east, which is, really nobody behind us, we thought it was a really great idea. In addition to that, the windows, as you can see, are pointing to the east. So you really don't have any noise issues because when you walk up the deck, it's kind of, see the one at the top? That was all open to the south. Lots of potential noise, lots of, maybe public, unnecessary public gathering. So now that's been eliminated. So we privatized it, albeit it was more money, which we're fine with. And we've decided to make these investments to make it a superior project. So that's about it. And if you have any questions, I have our general contractor here, Mr. Farrow, and Mr. Rule, who did this wonderful work that we're so proud of.
Did you say you relocated the deck around?
No,
Is that what you
actually,
said?
the deck was always there,
Okay.
but we privatized it because rather than have a flat roof, when you walk up, deck's a funny name. It's a platform that you walk up to go into the unit. So as a result of going up, it privatized that area so that the neighbors to the south, it's its own entity.
Okay.
So no noise transmission will go that way because, you're going to get calls, and I don't want that. Because if you get calls, I don't get projects approved.
Excuse me, was the deck for public use, for everybody's use, or for just the?
Well, specifically, the way it's designed, it's a great question. There's 4 separate entrances. So we have exterior entrances that are very private, and they go to the units that they service. So that particular section of the building has its own walk-up, and then the units, you go on the first floor, and then you go into the second. All it did is it just made everything kind of its own separate entity, and it's more private, rather than it being open.
So was it for everybody's use or not? The deck? If it stays a deck, can
Good
everybody
question.
access it or not?
Theoretically, it could have been. I guess everyone could have gone up there, although it'd have been difficult to manage. It would have been specifically, I think, for that section of the building.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Because you kind of get your own walkway up there. I mean, I guess theoretically, somebody from, 200 or 300 feet away could walk up there. It'd be kind of strange, but I just didn't want to, we still feel that it's just more private. for everybody, specifically our neighbors to the south.
I wouldn't have wanted to have the apartment next to the deck, you know.
Right, you're right.
Well, I can appreciate that, but I wasn't, I don't remember this last year, and I don't know if I was necessarily sitting on board then. But if it was proposed as a communal space, and that was part of the reason why it was moving forward, I think that's kind of what the questions might be toward. That's kind of what I was thinking, was this like a communal space that
No.
was supposed to be put forward? No?
No,
Okay.
just a flat roof.
Yeah.
So if you would walk up and you would be on a second floor and it was open, it'd be a flat roof. And it wasn't communal in the sense that everybody could use it. There's just a catwalk, I guess, is kind of the theory, that you walk up to go into your units. But it would have been open. And, you know, theoretically, potential noise, I mean, I don't know, you can't correct all that kind of thing. But what this did was, it has that kind of wall, if you will, and now it's privatized.
I'm sorry. Is this a glorified balcony for a unit, or everybody can access that? Because we're not understanding each other.
It is,
I think I might know I think I might understand what's.
take a shot at it.
What the confusion is.
So previously, what you have is at the southern end of the building shaped kind of like an L. At the southern end of the building, there's a little cluster of units. There's a stairway that serves those units. And on top of the fitness center, the deck, or whatever you want to call it, platform that was served by those stairs came out on top of that fitness center. And there was enough space that people could kind of hang out there. But it wasn't intended to be like a full-on deck with like amenities up there. It was a potential area where gathering could occur. And this, by putting up the second story, eliminates that area and keeps the stairs kind of behind the projection of the building. So that platform that people would have been walking on before, quite visible to the neighborhood to the south, is now hidden by the building, basically.
So, if I can, so you're saying that this area right here, and is this area we're talking about?
Yes.
Yeah.
So one time this was gonna be open.
Yeah, yeah,
And so you're just closing it off.
That's
is what you're
correct.
saying.
right, exactly.
But there was no rail on it, so it wouldn't have made it wouldn't have been.
Well, yeah, you wouldn't have been able to go all the way out to the end of the building, but you can see where the rail is. So there's an area there that was where people would be walking and things like that.
See, there's no rail. I mean, I guess theoretically you could illegally go up there, but there was no rail on top of that, so people could jump onto that, but it wasn't meant to be communal.
Right.
And jump over it?
Mentioning, I mean, I could see it just as a nuisance problem, you know. for
Liability?
everybody. Yeah, exactly.
Right,
Yeah, I think roofing is.
Because there's no rail, I mean, you could, and, you know, people will do things when they're not necessarily of sane mind, you know, you never know. So we're happy that it's safer.
What is your timeline looking like? You're cranking along pretty well here,
Well,
but
Mr. Farrow here has done an excellent job, and our expectation is to have it pretty much completed in the next 90 days.
90 days.
Yeah, it's moving along beautifully, and if any of you would like to tour it, it'd be our privilege to show it to you. It's very well done.
It looks
How would we
beautiful.
arrange that?
Pardon me?
How would we arrange that?
We'll send you an email, Amy will, and we'll make an appointment so that you can come in. I'll walk through it with you.
Okay.
Yeah, we'd love that.
We'll go over and walk around the deck, or the roof.
Oh, speaking of which, you mentioned about people, in case of an emergency, could get up on the roof. What is the thickness of the underlying planks for the roof shingles?
You're talking about the top of the roof?
Yes,
It's 7/16 OSB.
okay.
Yeah, it's over-engineered, the building. As a matter of fact, the sound transmission walls between them, the architect did a fabulous job by putting 2 walls between them. So you actually have, wall insulation, space, a wall insulation, and double, so there'd be no noise transmission issues. We've become quite good at that.
Yeah, no, I was just asking in case people were hesitant about jumping up on the roof, say, not to worry. We got a lot of thickness here.
Good question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions before
If I could get with you after the meeting, I just had a question on some of the correlation on the dates for the drawings. Being an engineer, I catch some of this.
Sure.
Different dates that I see here, just to make sure that all the drawings have our same revision date.
Agreed. Yeah, that's a good point.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, if there's no more questions, I'll entertain
My questionable memory, there was never any discussion of a public open area, it was just staircases.
Right.
So, if there's a little confusion, I think right now, my understanding is just that we're making a second floor, and part of that second floor area makes the staircase more of just a staircase situation for the units that staircase serves.
That's correct.
No, I wasn't even on. Hopefully that was okay.
I didn't want to interrupt you, though.
Okay, if that's,
Thank you.
I'll entertain a motion then. And Vice Chair usually makes a motion.
Really? No one told me that was part of the job.
Part of the job, you gotta sit over here next time too.
Let me pull up the notes.
Over there now?
Yeah, they'll rearrange name tag.
So I make a motion to accept the proposed amendments to the site plan for 424 through 444 Elliott Park Apartments.
I'll support that.
I have a motion, I have support. Roll call, please.
Mr. Fitzer?
Yes.
Mr. Kucera?
Yes.
Mr. McHale?
Yes.
Mr. Nushai?
Yes.
Mr. Pernick?
Yes.
Ms. Redmond?
Yes.
Mr. Sinaki?
Yes.
Mr. Watson?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Very good. Welcome to club.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
This is not going to go as strong.
Jim, you can talk to me about the dates on the.
Okay, I got it circled here, so no problem. Thank you.
Feel free to share email if they want to.
Oh, okay, sure.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Agenda item number 8 is other business. 8A is zoning ordinance amendment, discussion of cannabis and the primary caregivers. I wish Rennis was here from his other meeting, but we'll talk around him.
Yes, hopefully our attorney will be here soon, but in the absence of Rennis for the moment, I will kind of fill you in on what we've got here, and then we can go from there. I just got to get to it, because I've got like 7,000 things open. Okay. So, Michigan has a panoply of laws that govern marijuana. It's very confusing and less than ideal. I hope that one day we have a single law that covers them all. That's probably not forthcoming anytime soon. So we're dealing with the laws that we have. The law that we're specifically dealing with tonight is the 2008 Michigan Medical Marijuana Act, initiated Law 1 of 2008. This law permits and establishes rules governing the growing and selling of marijuana by a group of people called registered primary caregivers to another group of people called registered patients. You can be in both groups. So a registered primary caregiver can grow up to 12 plants per patient and can serve a maximum of 5 patients. So the patients are the registered patients and the grower is the registered primary caregiver. The caregiver can also grow up to 12 plants for personal use, provided that they are also registered as a patient. And well, nowadays with the recreational law, anybody can grow 12 plants for themselves, but that's how it works for the primary caregivers. So that means a registered primary caregiver can grow up to 72 plants as part of their operation. All plants have to be grown in an enclosed locked facility. Enclosed locked facility is a defined term in the statute.
Does a backyard constitute a closed locked?
It does not.
It does not, okay.
Yep. You could have an enclosed locked facility in your backyard, but your backyard itself would not qualify.
You're
Yeah.
saying enclosed, not a closed,
Exactly,
right?
yeah, exactly.
Which is.
Enclosed, yep.
Yeah.
So the state law doesn't permit communities to prohibit registered primary caregivers. Initially, a lot of communities regulated them as home occupations to kind of keep them out of sight. A lot of other communities didn't regulate them at all. We're in the second category there. There was a case at the Michigan Supreme Court last year, DeRuyter versus Township of Byron. And initially, the appeals court ruled the opposite way, but ultimately the Supreme Court came down with on the position that the Michigan Medical Marijuana Act, I'll call it the triple MA for short, does not nullify a municipality's authority to regulate land use under the Zoning Enabling Act as long as the community isn't prohibiting marijuana cultivation by a registered primary caregiver, and as long as the community doesn't impose restrictions inconsistent with the regulations established by state law. So it's an important case because it dispelled uncertainty about whether or not municipalities could limit registered primary caregivers to specific districts or impose greater restrictions on the use than those established by the state, and it finds that they can. Since the decision, a lot of communities have begun to limit the districts in which the uses can operate and develop other regulations for these uses. This has been especially acute in more rural townships, particularly rural townships on the fringe of metro areas. I work for a couple of those in my capacity as a consultant. And a lot of those communities had a major problem with people buying property just to put one of these little operations up. And, you know, they were just kind of not taking care of the property. They were growing something in a pole barn and just letting the rest of the property rot. In more urban communities, that can be, a similar problem can arise because a lot of people have bought houses specifically just to do this. In fact, the head of my department, Rod Arroyo, used to live across the street from one of these houses that was only a marijuana operation. It was in the middle of a nice subdivision in Macomb County. And it was just this one house that nobody lived in it, and it was just a marijuana growing operation. And that's not really what you hope for when you move into a neighborhood. Generally speaking, you hope for neighbors across the street. So when we look at potential impacts and considerations as outlined in our memo, most caregiver operations in the city right now are located in homes. That's the case in most communities. There's potential safety and health issues that are associated with those operations in homes. Mold is one of them because you're using a lot of water on these operations. So if you don't have your facility sterilized, and there's not really a state inspection standard for sterilization, you can wind up with a black mold problem over time, and that, of course, can have major ramifications for the inhabitability of the house if it gets out of control. There's also extremely high levels of water and electricity consumption associated with growing. In rare instances, that can actually create problems for the neighborhood. If someone, we had an issue in rural townships in particular where people were upgrading their electrical services from, a standard 100 or 200 amps for a residential home to 800 and causing brownouts in the area around them. And DTE has actually ceased providing upgrades automatically to that service level for residential uses because it was such a problem. It was really messing with their grid. But at a more reasonable level, the electricity consumption can actually present a fire risk. And there are also certain extraction activities where you're trying to take the product out of the plant that can use certain materials that have very low flash points. You don't really want that occurring in homes, generally speaking, because it can lead to fire pretty easily. Most caregivers aren't doing that, by the way. Butane extraction is not something most caregivers are doing. Most of them are snipping it and processing it and selling it, as the product that you might expect. But there are people who try to do it. So right now, one thing that we don't have is a requirement that caregivers live in a home if they're growing in the home. So someone could potentially buy a home and just to do that. With current real estate prices, they're probably not going to do that. But a couple of years ago, they might have. In 2010, it might have been a very attractive prospect. So someone might be holding on to a home from back then. If you have too many situations like that, it could have an impact on neighborhood cohesion, ultimately, if you don't have enough people living in the houses. Caregivers in non-residential districts. So if we locate caregivers entirely in non-residential districts, that can relieve some of the issues that the use can cause in a neighborhood, but it does lead to some other considerations. So commercial and industrial property under normal circumstances tends to be a little more expensive, tends to have a higher taxable value. It means that you're probably not going to have a single caregiver obtaining and maintaining a commercial property for the sole use of one primary caregiver operation. That means you might have multiple primary caregivers coming together to obtain a property. Or you might have a property that is otherwise used for something else, like an auto repair shop or something, that has a section of the building that's leased out to a caregiver operation. And I've seen in a few communities where you get kind of like a cannabis condominium where 5 or 6 caregivers are operating together in a building, and each one of them has to have, under state law, their own enclosed lock facility. They can't just have one open area where you rope it off and say, this is mine and that's yours. And you can actually tie certificates of occupancy to each facility being completed. But that is something that tends to happen in communities where the use is primarily permitted in commercial areas. And then you have also the issue of on-site distribution. In the absence of local regulation, a caregiver can distribute their product to their registered patients on site. And in a neighborhood that, generally speaking, home occupations are not supposed to be more intense than a typical residential use, right? And that can change the intensity if you're distributing on site and you have people coming multiple times a week, to pick up their product, if you will. So what we've provided is a amending ordinance. It's all formatted. You don't have anything in your ordinance to change, to revise. So this is all new language. So we've just given it to you in the actual amending ordinance format, even though we don't have a public hearing tonight. Normally, it's the first time you see that format. So it defines some of the terms that we're talking about, and these definitions are drawn directly from the statute. So we're mirroring state law with our terminology. The one thing that we have done is that instead of using the misspelling of marijuana that's enshrined in Michigan law, we're using the term cannabis, which is it's not only a more neutral term, but it is also the term that the industry uses. If you're in that industry, you're calling it cannabis. So that was the one change we made to the terminology for the purposes of our ordinance. Otherwise, we have an amending ordinance, and this is based on some discussion that we've had in the past. We have an amending ordinance that adds this as a permitted use in the I-1, I-2, and BRD2 districts. These are the districts that are going to have your more industrial buildings that are going to have space that could potentially be sectioned off and leased out for the use.
Joe, let me ask you a question. That sectioning out thing you're talking about, that can't happen in a residential area, right? That can only happen in a commercial building?
You could potentially do it in a residential area.
You could?
Yeah,
Okay.
you could potentially take a house and say, this bedroom is going to be a secured lock facility for this grower, and this bedroom is going to be a secured lock facility for this grower. Potentially, you could do that, yes.
Okay.
Yep. Currently. And what this means is, okay, we've got it as a permitted use in I-1, I-2, and BRD2. So what this means is that if you are currently a registered primary caregiver who is conducting your operations in your home, you would become a non-conforming use. And that means that you can continue to do that operation in your house. We're not kicking you out. But a new person couldn't come in and establish that use in a house. So anybody who's currently doing it can continue to do it. But a new primary caregiver couldn't come in and establish the operation in a home. Let's see, what else do I want to highlight here before we get into discussion? I was kind of hoping Rennis would come in at this point, because I know he wants to be part of this conversation. But anyway, each one of those listings of primary caregiver facility has a section reference to, it'll have a different name once the clear zoning ordinance is done, but right now it's section 1104, primary caregiver facilities. And what that does is it establishes some standards for the use. So we've got a fairly long purpose and intent statement that cites all of the laws and statutes and things that we're leaning on. And then we've got it's kind of a caveat, really, that the ordinance doesn't have an effect on patient use. If you're a registered patient, you can continue to use this product in your home as if nothing has changed, because functionally for you, nothing has changed. The state law is still what governs your use of the product. And of course, recreational use has been legalized at this point on private property. So if you can do it recreationally in your house, obviously, we're not going to prevent you from doing medical use on your own property. But we're specific about that in the language of this ordinance.
Joe, where does it say the zone?
That is on page 3 of the amending ordinance.
Okay. So these are recommended by you guys?
Yeah.
Why
Well,
I know
it's a
not the
little
same.
bit, it's a little bit our recommendation and also a little bit conversations that we've had at past meetings.
Okay, I'm confused by the BRD too, and I mean, I know it's not the same thing, but I feel like we should keep in mind the commercial cannabis industry and what we'll be taking into consideration then, and what we allow with this, in making sure it's in line with, because we don't want to say, well, 5 caregivers can go here, but you can't, right? And is there anything in here that allows or discusses limiting the proximity as we did in commercial to residential schools, things like that? I know that the BRD2 really is the only one that's really close to the residential area, or limits the number of caregiver facilities that we're allowing in each zoning area.
Sure. So one thing that we're not able to do is the way the other 2 statutes allow us to cap the number of facilities. That's something we can't do under the caregiver ordinance. So if we're permitting it in the district, we're permitting it in the district, and we're not saying there can only be 7 of them. Whereas with like a commercial grow operation or something, you could permit them in, like let's say you're a agricultural community, you could permit them in your ag district, and you could say we only want 5 of them. But we can't do that with the primary caregivers. We can't put a cap on the number. And this one doesn't have a proximity restriction the same way that a commercial facility probably would.
So because really, if we're allowing them to stack their licensing, they could function as big as a commercial facility, but yet they could be right next door to schools, residential. Again, I know we're talking BRD2, but that is right up against the neighborhood. Is that correct then?
That is correct, and that's part of the reason we're talking about this before setting a public hearing on it, because obviously we want it to be what you want it to be. So if we feel that there should be some sort of buffer, or even if it's just an adjacency standard, where it's not available on properties directly adjacent to residential, but it could be anywhere else in the district, because let's face it, if we start putting like a buffer from residential, we're going to run out of property pretty quickly, because all of our non-residential property is in strips along mile roads, basically. So we do have to be reasonable about the number of places in the city where we're permitting it. Otherwise, it becomes sort of a de facto prohibition. And that's not where we want to be going. So, I understand what you're saying about that, but in general, most of the proximity standards that you'll see in these ordinances around the state refer to specific types of facilities rather than actual residential uses. They refer to schools primarily. In some cases, communities have singled out other types of facilities such as parks. But very rarely have I seen a proximity standard that separates it from residential use.
Well,
And for one thing, we have some in the neighborhoods to begin with.
Right, but they're not stacking and putting, 7 caregivers.
We don't necessarily know that.
Well, legally, they're not, right? Because we're saying, and I know this might not be existing, I don't know the current law, but moving forward, we're saying a certain number of caregivers per square feet of building, correct? So is there a way to build into this, if it abuts to a residential property, then we are only allowing a certain number of caregivers in that facility? And as it, dissipates away from a residential area, they can, stack more caregivers within that facility? Does that make sense?
I understand what you're saying, yes. So adjacent to residential, fewer caregivers permitted per site.
It's kind of a slippery slope that we're on, because on the federal level, cannabis is illegal.
Right, and that's actually addressed in this text.
State level, it's legal, so the state will issue a license for some people to do this, and they don't tell us, they don't tell the city of Clawson who they're issuing the license to, so we don't know where these things are popping up at.
Right, we can discover them via the police records, right, though?
No.
Or sort of, I mean, it's really,
yeah.
you can intuit where they are,
Yeah, if
I
you
think
watch
is really what it
water,
is.
Very good at intuiting where they are. Yes, Joe's correct. But no, you can't use that. But yes, you can have such a regulation. Obviously, we're talking
Can you
about.
speak to the microphone, please? Thank you.
Thank you. My apologies. You can address some of your concerns, and perhaps successfully. So I say that because we're dealing with medical. This is with respect to medical marijuana, and certain standards will come in that I imagine at one point or another, one of our communities, whether this one or one of the communities around us, will deal with a direct challenge to those parameters that you've outlined, because it's not the first time that we've seen them. That I know of today, I've seen no challenges, therefore I think it's good as far as we're concerned for inputting the notes that Joe is so copiously taking here.
I guess I didn't look back at the zoning map. Can you display the zoning map? We just went through with the recommendation of smoking establishments, and we identified a BRD3, I thought.
Right.
And
B3.
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 And then this one is the two industrials, and I can't remember where they are, all of them, or what the difference between 1 and 2 is. And then how you came up with the third district, the BRD-2. And where are they in the city? It might help with an understanding of.
I don't think we have any restrictions at this point in time. If we're talking caregivers,
That's true. We have-
city's wide open.
we have
right?
no
I mean, you
restrictions
can-
at the
you can
moment,
open
yeah.
Your house or anybody's house, any place in town you want to do it, you can do it.
No, what I was
Your
talking
idea.
about is where we were going to propose allowing under special circumstances these multiple
use.
or single or potentially multiple, but they are caregiver, I guess the way that I would call them, caregiver grow operations under the caregiver number of product that they can grow.
4 or 5 guys getting together and running a semi-business, do we have any control over that effect of it?
So, to address the first question first, we have the zoning map up here. It's kind of small. So, I'll see if I can zoom in a little bit. Okay, so the BRD2 is here. This is that dark red color along Crooks Road, and a little bit along Maple. The I-1, there is no I-2 on the map at the moment. We don't actually have any land zoned I-2. We have an I-2 district in our zoning ordinance. That's kind of in the eventuality that someone were to propose something that's permitted in the I-2 and not permitted elsewhere. We would be looking at where it would be appropriate to put that. But the I-1, there's a little bit of it down here on Rochester, and there's an area of it here on North Rochester approaching the boundary with Troy, and then Troy, of course, has a ton of industrial, not that far here. There's a little corridor of it here and a little bit more of it over here. So there, and here are really the areas we're talking about. And trying to remember when we discussed this. It was the second meeting in June, I think. I want to say it was the second meeting in June that we discussed locations. And those were the districts that we landed on as kind of the most promising at the time. So that's what we put in the document that was provided to you. But of course, it's still up for discussion. We haven't adopted anything. We're not recommending anything tonight. We are looking at ordinance language and figuring out if there's anything about it that we want to change. So these are all good questions, and questions that we're hopefully going to walk out of here with answers to tonight, so that we can then tee you up for a public hearing.
Joe, can I ask you, oh, sorry, you want to go?
I guess it's kind of intuitive to me when you say an industrial district. I look at industry, manufacturing, buildings that do product.
Sure.
Can you remind me what's in the BRD2? I know that there's a lot of stuff up along that section, and I know that south of Elmwood, there are lots there that they have basically office buildings in them. So what's allowed currently in a BRD2 district?
Sure. So the BRD2 district currently, if I can get my trackpad to work properly, permits, it's not scrolling. Come on. All right. Permits. Sorry, I'm having to grab the little slider thing to scroll. I'm sure it has a name. I just don't know what it's called. So the permitted uses in the BRD2 district include offices, many different kinds of offices, but generally speaking, we're talking about professional office. It includes medical offices, instructional or vocational institutions. It singles out alarm and security businesses, phone message centers, telemarketing businesses, data processing and computer centers, any use in which the principal function is of conducting research, design, testing, and pilot or experimental product development, which is a fairly industrial use. A high technology service use, which has as its principal function the providing of services including computer information transfer, communication distribution, etc. Public facilities, let's see. Essential services building, printing, publishing, and duplicating, photographic processing, which is a little bit of a obsolete use. And then when we look at the next level of review, we get accessory uses to those uses. And then finally, look at special approval uses, and we've got messenger services, mailing services, delivery services, kind of like processing, sorting, and distribution functions aren't allowed actually, so it's kind of like a drop-off pickup facility that's permitted there. Offices of manufacturers, agents, sales representatives, and others requiring display areas and limited warehousing. Banks and credit unions are permitted there, display halls and convention centers, hotels and motels. We do have one hotel on Maple there. And then uses, we have kind of this generic provision that we can find that uses of a similar nature or class as those listed in the district can be approved by the Planning Commission if it finds that there's a substantial similarity. So that's what's permitted there right now. There are a couple of legacy, outright industrial facilities over there as well. But establishing a new one would be
Doesn't the statement
tough.
of intent for that speak more towards what we envision in towards our master plan and what we kind of see that growing into? And when I think of I'm sorry to interrupt, but when we discuss this in a commercial capacity, as I read the statement of intent, I just didn't feel like it minced well with one where it's right abutting to the neighborhoods, and two, that the future use is supposed to be campus style, pedestrian use, walkability type thing. And as we've talked about prior meetings with different things, including the smoking establishments, pedestrian campus style use doesn't seem to carry the same use as these types of facilities. And that's just kind of like my thoughts, especially when I read the statement of intent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there is a statement of intent. It's several paragraphs long, so I guess I won't read the whole thing. But what it is it's referring to the master plan, not the last one, but the one before that, and it's basically it's acknowledging that there are some existing industrial uses there, and long term, its vision for the area is that it transitions away from those to that more campus type environment that you're talking about. It's talking about interconnected sidewalks, which would be an ongoing project there because most of the side streets, there's a couple of them, don't have sidewalks because they were originally developed as little industrial parks and no one put sidewalks in them back then because people just didn't think that way. And that's kind of a project by project thing. When a new site plan gets approved, we require that they put the sidewalk in, and eventually over time, you have enough redevelopment, you get a full sidewalk network. We don't have like a bond or anything that's going to go and put sidewalks in yet. Maybe someday we will. Yeah, it's tending to kind of move away from the dominant industrial and general business uses that are over there over time. And it's also looking for uses that have, it specifically uses the phrase medium intensity land coverage. And there's another, where does it say in there? Let's see. Minimal, okay. District is intended to accommodate uses that will have minimal impact on the quality of life issues for the adjacent neighborhoods. Quality of life issues inherent in the intent of this division shall be addressed and demonstrated in development proposals. May include but are not limited to land use adjacency, traffic flow and access management, building mass, building placement, siting and compatibility, architectural features, landscape design, lighting, and there's kind of a note about general harmony and eco-friendliness there too. So, I mean, I guess I understand what you're saying. The point I'm going to make is that you literally have no districts that are not residential that are not directly adjacent to residential districts. So we kind of have to make some calls on where it goes, basically. And based on the earlier conversation we had, these were the 3 districts we put in there, because they seem to be the only 3 that would be acceptable at all. And it's a matter of you deciding whether or not that's where you want it. And if you want to exclude something, then if we can come to some sort of general consensus on that, then that's what we'll do.
But we must be mindful not to legislate away people's ability with respect to this, to conduct, I'm going to call it a business, which is not, but to do the caregiving. If we do that, we're going to land ourselves in a position to where somebody else is going to tell us that, no, you cannot do that. And obviously we want to avoid all that. So that you have to be mindful, and I'm not, and this is tricky for the both of us or for any of us that do this to say, you know, of course you can do it. However, be mindful, but that's exactly what we're telling you. So just something to keep in mind.
It's tricky as to what you could legally defend or what you could not legally defend. The line here says caregivers are not required to live in the home at present. So it is possible for a caregiver or multiple caregivers to operate out of an otherwise unoccupied house. Can we as a city pass an ordinance that you can't do that? And can we override the state of Michigan?
You can't. You won't be able to. Obviously, we're in all the, and I think, I don't know if Joe did it today, but I know on prior occasion he's listed all the marijuana acts, and there's about 5 that I count. And they all obviously work in interesting ways, and they don't necessarily work in tandem, but they're sort of plus. Sometimes they cover similar grounds. At other times, they're expansive in and of themselves. Ultimately, though, we will not be able. We're preempted through several of these statutes from state law
to live in the house.
Precisely.
You can't do that.
Yeah, and actually, if I remember, I won't be able to tell you the name, but there was a case with respect to that dealt with, at least certainly in dicta, talked about exactly that issue on account of the user didn't. Remind me, Joe, if you recall, but the user didn't have to stay in the home. User couldn't both use and be a caregiver at the same time. I think that was the case. And part of the dicta, they dealt with that issue, which is to say that it's not necessarily law right now, but come at the time when we pass such a law, that's exactly what we'll be faced with. That's why we have to be a little mindful, I think.
I think we're going to have to look closely at what other cities and townships around us are doing and see if we can glom on as much
and cities, and there's a lot of, and this is, I mean, it's not quite the Wild West, but it is in certain respects. There's, cities are taking, jabs at various different aspects of this and have taken various different approaches. One of the conversations that Joe and I had over the last few weeks was with respect to our ability to license. And do we have that ability to license or not? under this constellation of these 5 larger laws? And my sense is no, because they're licensed by the state. What right, how do we would de facto be preempting them somehow, because there would be on the situation where we say, no, you may not have a license because you don't satisfy whatever standards we put in place. However, the state has already said that you have a license.
Right.
Well, I'm here to report to you, I live in Troy, and my fair city has such an ordinance where they're seeking licenses. I don't know how. They're setting themselves up for exactly what I hope you would not want to set yourself up for. I think that's, so it's tricky. Nobody, I think, has the answer. Everybody's taking a lot of, stabs at it to figure out, to try to ensure that the community is safe. You have the ability to legally, do this, but without harming, obviously, the surrounding area. So it's tricky.
So my question is, and I thought that I read in the preamble to this, that we specifically state that our residential areas on an individual lot cannot support the growth of 72 plants. So if we state that, and we're saying that we're moving it to other districts where they can have enclosed buildings, the districts that we have are by definition not residential. So I guess my question with respect to the BRD 2 district is, come back with us with an assessment of why the BRD 2, for a facility that is basically, in my mind, more like manufacturing. The only people that go into that building, as if I was making, seat covers for automotive. The only people that go into that building are the workers, and then the people who deliver material, and the people who take material away. So that is more, to me, a definition of an industry where you can design and execute nice-looking, proper buildings, but they're in an area where only the people that work there are supposed to be there. You don't have the items that you listed in the BRD 2, which would be doctor's offices, medical facilities, schools. That is more, yes, there's a facility that does something, there are people that they're there, but in addition to that, there's a come and go in that particular district. So I would like an explanation of why the BRD 2 district could have basically a locked and closed facility that is industrial, because only the people who work there go in and out. So if you were saying that that's a definition of our industrial section in a small city that really doesn't have, any big industry, because we just don't. But we have a couple of sections you could say that are characterized as industrial. They are now, they probably always will be. So if you wanted to put that industry in there, here's how you do it. So that's the explanation that I would have to help this planning commission go forward on this.
Would I be correct if I said that we have more control over marijuana dispensaries in our city than we have over marijuana caregivers?
Yes,
The
you would be
laws are
correct.
written that way.
Because it's, this is ultimately medical. So I believe some rationale is actually, necessary as we pass this, where we have, if we, rationale in the sense that a reasonable standard, whatever that is, and I don't know that I have the answer to just provide to you right now, but if we develop a reasonable standard, some sort of standard for this, where we say, this is the reason we are staying out of these districts, but we believe it makes sense. This is the rationale behind our decision making. I think they'll be easier to defend if, and when the time comes, as opposed to we say, well, we simply don't want it here. We're opting for, wherever, far away and out of sight and out of mind. That's not gonna be good enough.
Rennis or Joe, do you know, I'm assuming it would be in the Medical Marijuana Act, or one of the CFRs, essentially, the regulations, the implementing regulations.
David, I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I apologize.
Certainly. Sorry about that, Scott. My question is whether or not the act or one of the acts that would cover primary caregivers, et cetera, are they allowed to be entities, LLCs, incorporated, or is it only for individuals?
The license you have to hold in an individual name. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I suppose you could incorporate, but it may not make any sense ultimately. Obviously the responsibility would fall on the individual licensee.
Yeah, the scope of their services, the scope of their, product and distribution, et cetera, is limited by the Medical Marijuana Act anyway.
Precisely.
But when I start thinking about, all right, well, if someone organizes an LLC, are they more inclined because they have perhaps a shield from potential liabilities, or a greater shield than an individual from potential liabilities I'm just curious about whether that's possible, because you have that potential shield and you may push the envelope on what, and then as a municipality, we can't do much more than.
Actually, it's a fair and fine point. I think ultimately speaking, I think where it would come into play will be exactly in this licensing issue, and in the determination, do we choose to license or not? Do we go that route? Because I think the license that the state grants is not an LLC or Inc. or any form of, or any corporate form. It gives to the individual. The individual applies and the individual gets it. So I think, and like famous last words, but I think the answer is no, we don't have to necessarily concern ourselves with that per se. But I can imagine, I'm sure you can see, that where a corporate form could have a role to play, even though not directly, for example, as far as the location is concerned. So I could see that the answer may be partial. There may be an opportunity for further ability to protect that particular, the actions of, the licensee. But again, the license goes to the individual.
Okay. And I don't mean to take it down a tangent that's not relevant to.
No, I think it's a fair point. I mean, it's a fair point. Actually, and you're exactly right that we as a municipality would be the ones to suffer those ramifications. The state is not concerned because the state has the licensee. They have them directly. Whereas by the time it gets to us, there may be an opportunity. But I think, and this is where it comes, this is the issue I think that we have with the act, and in these 5 acts, but particularly Medical Marijuana Act and the way it's designed and the way, the scope of it and sort of the goal behind it, it was meant to remove that entire scheme and operation, or whatever you want to call it, away from law enforcement, away from a regulatory ability to whatever the extent may be. So I think that's why we grapple, and bodies such as this one grapple with these kinds of issues.
Thanks.
I have, and I'm not following up, and it's gonna sound like I'm way off subject here. So.
See, those of us attorneys, we really thrive on this.
Oh, yeah, I guess so. Well, so you discussed I-2. That doesn't exist, right? You said I-2 does not currently exist?
It's not on the map. The district is in the zoning ordinance.
Okay.
But it has not been placed on the map anywhere.
Okay, can you refresh my memory on what it might say in that zoning ordinance? And is that not an exclusionary thing if we're saying they can go into a zone that essentially doesn't exist?
If that's the only place we let them go, yeah.
Great idea.
Yeah, absolutely it is.
Right, I mean, I'm like, you're onto something.
Yeah, if that's the only place we're letting them go, yeah, it absolutely would be
Okay,
exclusionary.
well, and in turn, I'm asking if there's actually a little bit of a liability in that, in holding us to that, if we don't actually have an area zoned for that, but we're telling them they can go there. Oh, how does that leave us kind of open and vulnerable? Does it, or?
I think I missed the part of the show talking about I-2, so you have to catch me up.
Yeah, well, it's just one of the districts that's listed for discussion
Okay.
in the ordinance, so I-1, I-2, and BRD2.
Okay, I see. Yeah, liability is an interesting concept. Like, it's a scary word in the municipal format. That said, people can sue us for any reason, and most days without reason. So I don't know how helpful it is to go down the road of, well, we may face liability, therefore we should be worried about that. I think in my prior statement, I don't want to confuse not confuse you, but I don't want to lead you down the road of thinking in those terms. I think we have to be mindful about the ordinances that we pass on account of we want to be as open and accommodating as a city, protect the well-being, health, safety, welfare of the city, but without necessarily having to think in those terms, in terms of liability. If people don't like the ordinance that you pass, I assure you that an attorney or any attorney that will touch it will be able to find a reason to file a lawsuit against us to challenge exactly whatever we pass. So do not limit
Okay.
yourself in that sense.
Well, all right, maybe I'll state the question differently.
Sure.
I don't necessarily feel comfortable stating that we are okay with this ordinance, this being a zoning part of this ordinance, without knowing the full parameters of what that is.
What do you mean?
It's not on the map. It's a zoning that's not actually existing on our map. And I'd have to refresh my memory on what it actually talks about in the zoning ordinance for I-2. But if it doesn't exist, that leaves a lot open there. And I guess I don't feel so comfortable. I don't know about anybody else.
Just worried about rezoning to that.
To that, yeah, to the I-2, I see. Yeah, again, I think, I understand your point, and you may well be correct as far as that's concerned, and I think, proper ordinance creation would entail you knowing exactly what you're creating or what standards there you're setting for wherever. So that's certainly, and I think that's why Joe is here, that's why we're here, to design those parameters, what this body is comfortable with, and part of it is, well, not necessarily guesswork, because, we work with you, but, to a certain extent, it is exactly that, to where we're trying to ascertain, based on this discussion, what you're comfortable with, what makes sense, what are those reasonable standards, what works for this community, that's why you're here.
I mean, ultimately, I think part of my concern when we're looking at the zoning map, I'll throw it back up there. If I can figure out how. Is that if the I-1 district is really the only place we're allowing it, that's very constricted.
It is.
On our map. So I feel like there has to be something else. And, when we look at the B districts, the whole idea of those is storefronts, places where people come and go all day. And that's not really what this particular use is. So it doesn't seem appropriate for any of the B districts or the Westgate, which is basically shopping centers. It's certainly not appropriate for downtown. The whole idea there is you have a lively pedestrian environment. And BRD1 is, small properties that are essentially an extension of downtown. To the south, you have your office district, which is primarily along Main Street to the north. But there again, you've got parks and schools right nearby that, and that just doesn't seem like the right place for it. And I think that's part of the reason that BRD2 is the other listed district, is that, we're trying to give people a practical potential of having one of these operations in the facility or in the city. And if it's just in the I-1 and nowhere else, we're not necessarily giving people enough of a practical potential to have one of these operations in the city.
Joe, I'm not trying to exclude anything, and I'm not trying to beat you up, I promise. I'm okay, I actually feel okay about the BRD too, if we are able to, like we discussed earlier, kind of regulate the impact on residential and go from a lesser impact to a more dense impact as it moves towards Crooks 15, I guess. But the I-2 is a big concern to me, not actually having it on the map. I don't know if that's something you would want to discuss, placement of that or what that entails in terms of the master plan, but that's kind of where I stand.
I think it's important to address that. So it's fairly common for communities to have districts in their zoning ordinance that aren't on their map. And in a community like Clawson, which is built out, the I-2 is sort of that heavy industrial district where we just don't have room for most of those facilities. We have to address them somewhere in our ordinance. And what it basically comes down to is we have certain areas of our community that are planned for potential industrial uses. So if someone were to be looking to rezone to the I-2 district, they would be looking, if they were going to have a hope of having property rezoned to I-2, they would be looking in industrial areas, and they would probably be most likely looking at I-1 property and upgrading I-1 property to I-2, if you will, so that you could have the facility that you were looking to do that's not permitted in the I-1.
So they would have to go through that process no matter what then? The rezoning?
Yeah, they would have to
Yes.
go through the rezoning
Okay.
process with a public hearing, yep.
Okay.
And that would be here and at the city council. So you've got, I mean, just to kind of give you a sense of what's permitted in the I-2 district, everything that's permitted in I-1 is also permitted in I-2. But you've got like auto manufacturing, major manufacturing and assembly uses, machine shops, processing and refining and food storage, cement manufacturing, which is a very intense use. It even talks about petroleum production, which I can't even imagine, but, I mean, there's just not enough room for that. But, I mean, petroleum refineries are like the size of Clawson. So it's not probably practically ever going to happen here, but, we're taking it into consideration. I don't know that there are any special approval uses in that district. Oh, junkyards and power plants, basically. And radio and television towers are the special land uses. So it's the real heavy stuff that, practically speaking, there's just not really much room for it in Clawson, And I think it was put in there sort of by default because it's going to be, if it's permitted in I-1, it's going to be permitted in I-2 because I-2 is inclusive of all I-1 uses. So, I mean, I think that's how I-2 was handled. And I think there's a reason that it's not on the map is that there's no properties for all practical purposes that could actually accommodate most of those uses. If someone were to come up with a way to do it, we would entertain their request to rezone. We may find that it's not appropriate, but, ultimately it would be down to an applicant to say, look, I really want to do this here. I think this is an appropriate place for it. I'd like to rezone these properties to make it happen.
That's helpful.
Sure.
Thanks.
Sorry, Joe, why would somebody rezone a property from I-1 to I-2 if the individual is only aiming to have a medical marijuana?
I can't imagine that you would.
Okay.
I don't think it would be worth your time or money.
You'd open yourself probably to more scrutiny, if anything.
Well, that's true, yeah. You'd have a public hearing where you wouldn't normally have much of any approval process. But yeah, so I mean, the I-2 really includes everything that's an I-1, so you probably don't even really have to list it. I think, I wish she could have been here tonight, because I think when Jill was putting together the amending ordinance, she thought, okay, well, I-2, and then it's already covered, I guess, in that one that says, hey, everything that's an I-1 is also an I-2. So we probably don't actually have to list it independently there.
Well, it makes us look like we're giving more though, right? I'm okay.
So in discussing the amendment, we're going to try to throw as many things at it that we can that you cannot legally justify, right? Is that how this is going to play out? I'd like to say that you can't grow marijuana in the house unless you have to physically live in the house at the same time, but you're telling me I can't say that.
Well, that's actually case law that says no.
Yeah, well, ultimately, we're not really permitting it in homes anymore. It's just that you're going to have the non-conforming uses.
Correct. Anybody that's, anybody, and I think that's what, and you probably heard it from Joe before, anybody that currently has it, you can't, it's grandfathered in. I mean, we don't, well, it's not quite grandfathering, but that's, so.
Right,
but
yeah.
de facto.
It has to have been legally established, too.
Right.
If someone's doing it and they didn't legally establish their operation, they're not in compliance with state law, that's another issue, and that's a violation in the same way it would be now.
I have a question about that. And I think I asked this last time, but Rennis, I don't think you were here. Does that grandfather, does that convey, did we already talk about this, if it stays with the person or conveys with the home, or like when that expires? Because that's kind of the essence of what these smoking establishments were kind of based on, are like these grandfathered in type things, right? So what's the future of that look like so much?
So this is caregivers, it follows the licensee.
It follows the licensee.
Yeah.
So it's not something that they can sell as if it were a smoking
No.
establishment to another person?
No.
Okay, okay.
It's an individual, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Your license moves with you, it doesn't stay with the land. So like when we approve a special land use, that would typically run with the land. If someone new moved in, they could do that same use there. But in this case, the licensee, if they leave the property, their license goes with them, and someone new has to come in and reestablish the use. These are very good questions, guys. I'm very happy with this
Accomplished our
discussion.
discussion.
I still need a definition of why we're doing what we're doing.
A definition?
Yes, you mentioned rationale, and
Oh, an explanation, meaning a reason behind this?
yes.
Well, I in my mind, and obviously
Yeah,
this.
but written down. The planning commission, this is the rationale for why we are proposing specific amendments to zoning with respect to caregiver grow operations. Boom. This is why what we're doing. This is what we understand as the reasons for.
You're looking for the
Making it
preamble
part-
to the Constitution, and I will provide it to you. It'll
Oh,
be
yeah, all
far
right.
more eloquent when I write it, when we write it down. But I imagine it's going to stem from those core concepts that we have as far as municipalities are concerned, and bodies such as this one. We're doing this for the health, safety, and welfare of the community, right? And I think there's a need for this community to properly regulate caregivers, which up until now have been sort of the Wild West. So when we do so, we're going to start with 70 years ago, our founding father gathered here, right?
I
And then
can
we're going to
handle
lead
that.
exactly to health, safety, and welfare.
Okay.
Is that fair?
Yes.
Because that's what I've heard. I mean, that's, I think, what we've heard from this body, right, as far as the desire behind this ordinance. And I think the community, it will resonate with the community when we come back.
And can you print that in Old English?
I'm sorry, yeah. Well, I intend to.
And I think a great many of the specifics on that are embodied in our memo as well. It's just a matter of, how they're phrased.
All right, I have one more question in terms of regulating, and you said the C of O is, let's say there's 4 caregivers in one facility, each one needs a C of O. If one lags, then that person, their enclosed space is like put on hold kind of thing, right?
Right.
So we're able to regulate each compartment of a facility. Who is it that enforces, because this is kind of like on a city level now, right? As opposed to the state on a commercial level. Who is it that kind of comes in and holds them up to a code, or comes in and surveys these properties, and how often is that done?
It falls on our building department and their little raft of inspectors. So in the same way that you would need to pull electrical permits if you wanted to, put a deck on your house and wire it up with some outlets and lights, a person who's setting one of these up needs to come and pull their electrical permits to set up their, facility so that they can have their grow lamps on. If you are going to put plumbing in there, you need to come get a plumbing permit and all that, and those all come with inspections that make sure everything is done properly.
But
And what you
yearly,
wind
is
up
that
with.
done as well? Like, to renew a license, is it the same type of thing?
No, it's not done. I mean, those kinds of things aren't done yearly. They're not like reassessed after the initial inspection. If a certificate of occupancy has been granted, then generally speaking, the certificate of occupancy is valid until there's no more occupancy and someone else wants to come in and reoccupy.
What holds them compliant to not having, you hope that, the building stuff, you won't have mold on the ceilings and, this guy's not actually growing like 600 plants while his neighbor's doing the right thing. And, but what holds them accountable, and how do we kind of hold them to a standard where it seems like the commercial aspect has that built in place because they have regulations and they have relicensing? Is there something that we have?
The ultimate and very unsatisfying answer is that we don't really have a way to do that because we're not the state, and the state is the one that's ultimately responsible for determining whether or not someone is in compliance with the state law.
The regulations of their license, yeah.
Right,
It's
so
different in caregivers then. Are they
It
not,
is.
they're not subject to a yearly thing as the commercials? Okay.
yeah, exactly. We have so much more control of the commercial and even the commercial scale recreational stuff. Primary caregivers, the state kind of designed the law to take a lot of this stuff out of our hands, so we just really can't. As much as we might like to, we just really can't verify some of this stuff.
So in order to make a claim or a complaint against one of these, you go through the city? Like, do they call the
Yeah.
police? Or do they have to go and call Laura or something like that? Is that how it works? I'm just curious. Like, if neighbors have complaints coming up, is it something that the police can even come and do anything about? Or are
They
they
can.
kind of pigeonholed? Okay.
Yeah, they can, and most likely a complaint is going to come to the city first, because typically that's where people turn when they have a complaint.
Yeah.
They see something happening, they're not happy about it, they'll probably contact, like code enforcement or the planning and zoning department or one of those, or planning and building department, sorry, or one of those entities. Or someone they know on city council or something. They're going to most likely start with the city, and from there, the city would refer it to the police department most likely, so that the police department could then take over the complaint and figure out what's going on. And the police, they're able to escalate if they need to. But ultimately, it might come down to, the state revoking a license or something. But generally speaking, if it's like a blight issue or a noise issue or something else that's causing problems locally, the city most likely will be the one that handles it and ultimately gets a lid on it.
So with all of that said, with this ordinance, there's no way for us to enforce the implementation of this. It's only in reaction if we hear a complaint.
Not necessarily, because you are de facto, right? As far as the implementation of this ordinance, you're doing it proactively on account of where every new person that's coming in trying to be a caregiver in the city, where they would go, right? That's what you're determining. If you're asking about everybody that's already here, you're right, we are limited, and we're limited because of our past. And the reason that Joe is here presenting this to you is just that all too recently did we have, a court case that basically gave cities, municipalities the green light to be able to regulate. Nobody thought we had the ability to regulate at all up until this point. So even though it feels and it is late, there's good reason why it's late, unfortunately. So but yeah, future, absolutely, we'll be able to regulate, control within these very real defined parameters. But as far as anything that's already here, unfortunately, we're limited.
Okay, thanks.
Is that enough for discussion? Does that give you something to go on to? I'm assuming you're going to bring this back to us again, right?
Yeah, I think we can bring it back one more time with some of these things addressed, maybe a couple little refinements to the language we've got here, and then have one more discussion.
Very good.
I'm looking so forward to the preamble to the Constitution by the administration of the city of Clausen. That's pretty good.
Yeah, it'll make Jefferson blush, trust me.
When in the course of human events.
Delivery by owl is probably appropriate as well.
Greg, you practice your,
You really do.
your very large signature when you put that on there.
Okay, let's check that out. Let's move on to B, the master plan update.
Okay, so the big update on that is that the bond issue passed, which I'm sure most of you are aware of. So that it kind of clarifies things, right? Because now we know we're not dealing with a true hypothetical. We're dealing with something that's going to happen eventually. We don't know exactly what the time frame is. It's not going to be this year, but something will happen eventually. So with that in mind, we're kind of retooling some of the materials we had for a workshop at the Planning Commission level. And our hope is that the next meeting will be primarily focused on that. We don't have any applications in for next meeting. We have the building materials public hearing, and we can do that and then just focus on the master plan at the next meeting. One thing I did want to share with you, though, is that this will be going on the city website if it's not already there. I'll even put it on the screen, even though it'll be very hard to read. I'm going to talk about it anyway. So we created a little FAQ just about the school sites and, what's currently permitted there. Why are we even thinking about these sites? And then that's available. It's available on the website, but it's also something that, anybody could hand to a person who has one of these questions and say, well, actually, we've thought about this. And, it just answers some very basic questions. First of all, what's currently permitted on these sites? If the school shut down tomorrow and they sold the land, what could you do there? Well, of course, you could do single-family homes. You could make it into a park. You could do a family daycare home. You could do home occupations in your home if you have one there. But places of worship and other schools, public, private, and parochial schools, municipal facilities, state licensed residential facilities with 7 or more residents, like a group daycare home, private non-commercial recreational areas, like, for instance, the community pool at a subdivision. Those are permitted there. Pretty unlikely, but a cemetery is permitted there as well. So that kind of clarifies for people, well, here's what could happen there if the schools were sold tomorrow. And then it kind of follows up with some other questions. Again, they're way too small to read up there. Let me blow them up. There we go. So there could be a church or private school in this location. Yes, there could. A recreational facility like a YMCA, possibly, but That's pretty unlikely in a location like that. What if homes were built there instead? We're basically telling, here's what they could be. They could be up to 2 stories and 25 feet high. They have 25-foot setbacks, and they have to be a minimum of 1,248 square feet. Why can't the school properties be preserved as play and recreation space? Well, we do have a 5-year recreation plan. It was adopted in 2018, so it's valid through, it's actually 2022 because it's not, each year counts, so it doesn't start at 0, it starts at 1. So the other thing is that the school owns the properties and they can sell them to whoever they want, so they're making the decision and they don't necessarily have to sell them to us, and they would have to sell them to us in order for us to make them into a park. So there's some other considerations there. Our recreation plan doesn't call for the acquisition of property as a goal either. So we would probably be looking at amending our recreation plan if we wanted to acquire those properties. Why is the city considering other types of homes? And, we're just some rationale for that. And then how can we find out more? And we've got just, a link to the website and some other info there for people to get informed. But, and then I guess the most basic question at the front, are the school sites for sale? And no, they're not for sale, not yet anyway, but in the future, we see them as being for sale eventually. So I did want to share that with you. That's it for me. I drove to Connecticut this weekend and back, so I'm kind of running out of gas here, to be honest.
What do you anticipate this master plan workshop?
We're going to be talking about it's going to be kind of a follow-up on the public open house. We're going to be talking about the building forms that you're comfortable with, including in the plan.
Joe, can you share with us the outcome? Was that given to us?
We have a summary of it that will be included in your packet next time.
Oh, okay, that you'll give us percentage and votes and stuff? Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
And was that ever talked about with the city, about the city buying that land as a recreational use that you're aware of? An actual discussion?
I don't know that there's been an actual, do you know of any discussion? I don't think there's been any.
Okay.
Yeah. I think, obviously that's something that has to be done at the city council level, and that hasn't occurred.
That's your master plan.
So with that, does this discussion have a logical time frame?
Yeah, in terms of the actual time frame for finishing the master plan amendment, we're looking at within this calendar year. So we want to be done with it this year. And that gets us set up for, whatever course of action the school district takes. I'm guessing they're not going to be selling these properties within the next year, but.
But you're wanting to amend it to zone it for those uses?
There's no work on the zoning map at this point. This is purely planning.
Okay.
So what a master plan does is it sets the table for rezonings in the future, essentially, or for amendments to the zoning ordinance, be they to the map or the text of the ordinance.
So you're going to set forth an idea of what you want those to look like?
Exactly.
Okay.
So this is what the community was amenable to. So here's what we're recommending if these sites are ever sold, that these are the parameters under which they could be redeveloped.
But it's not an amendment, you said, right?
Yeah, it's not
just
an
a
amendment, yeah.
recommendation, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
It's a recommendation, essentially, yeah. You're saying what the city would like to see.
Okay.
And then ultimately, we might amend the zoning ordinance in response to that.
But not by end of year, right?
Yeah, but not by the end of the year,
okay. I was like,
No, we can take our time on that because, again, the schools aren't going to be on the market, it's certainly not by the end of this calendar year.
So if the school, and you might not have an answer to this, sorry, I know you're tired. So if we decided, and we can't write this necessarily out, I know that when I talked to the superintendent, he mentioned they wanted to spend extra money taking those buildings down. Because essentially they don't want them to be schools, and I understand that. If we can't necessarily, I just thought that was kind of a silly use of money because they can get a Brownsfield there and essentially not really have to pay for it. Is that something that we can support the schools in, or not so much in that?
It's a separate jurisdiction, strictly speaking, so not really. We don't really have anything to say about it, unfortunately. I can't disagree that it's kind of unfortunate to just see the buildings taken down by default.
Spending millions to take it down when they can get government support in that.
Right.
Okay.
But it's ultimately not our decision. It's the school
Yeah.
the school district's decision. So.
Yeah, based on what I read in the paper, anybody can correct me if I'm wrong, but construction wasn't even going to be started until the middle of next year.
Right. Yeah.
For the new one,
For the new one.
the updated version of
For the updated condensed version of putting all 3 levels of schools in one campus.
Yeah.
So you still have to have your regular
Oh yeah, but they're talking when I talk.
facilities.
They're talking about part of the bond, from my understanding, was payment to take the current buildings down even after they're not in use. And I was curious about like why we're spending that money when essentially a developer could, if they are even, or a builder could come in and get a Brownsfield and get help so that the school isn't using some of that money in order to have to take it down even after use. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, but
I think they just wanted to eliminate potential competition for
That
students too.
seems to be the rationale.
that was, and I understand, and I support
I
it.
mentioned that a long time ago in our meetings that, because I brought it up, that, yeah, you could have somebody come in for a private school and that would be a threat to any kind of students.
If you're a school board and you're trying to consolidate the schools because we're losing students, I think it makes sense to eliminate the buildings. Why would you say, hey, let's set up some competition so that we can have more students potentially drawn out of our district? That doesn't make sense to me, but I can see their thinking behind it.
But if they can get government assistance on help, that saves the bond money too, though.
That makes sense, yes. But the other end of taking the buildings down as quickly as they can, yeah, I wouldn't leave the potential for someone to want to open up another school there.
Yeah, well, we're not looking, because construction's not gonna start until '22, so.
Yeah.
From the information presented to the planning commission, can you give a definition? Are those properties already platted?
Yes.
To individual
they were
R2 lots?
They were platted back in the day. We actually have the plat maps, which will be, we'll include them for you so you can see what how they're platted.
So we could get 100% R2 minimum sized homes in there?
Potentially, yep.
Well, what else can the master plan do if the owner of the property says, it's R2, go for it? And the developer comes in, because we've seen the intent, because they're businesses, of developers to try to maximize their land use and maximize their return on investment. So I'm struggling with why and how, since it's not city property, what any discussion of the planning commission and master plan has that wouldn't possibly be contested by the property owner. So help me out with that when you bring this to a master plan discussion.
We're talking about redevelopment. If they were to keep it the same way, of course, there would be no room for this body. If it's school use going forward, there's no room for this body to make any determination. But if there's redevelopment of any sort, they're gonna have to redevelopment by the standards, they have to redevelop it by the standards of the city. Whatever they are, whatever this body, council sets them to be. So I think that's the reasoning behind what Joe is proposing. It makes sense that you're proactive, I think, in that sense. Does it make sense?
I'm stuck on the scenario if I owned all them chairs and they're zoned in that chairs and they've always been plotted in that chairs, but I never used them for chairs, and now I got somebody coming in and say, hey, I'll give you a barrel full of money to put everybody in those chairs, and then Greg comes over and says, no, we're gonna rezone this and you can only have a third of them chairs. So I'm trying to figure out how we, as part of the planning commission and being on the master plan, can do that to someone else's property.
All day, every day, since the founding of this republic. That's the ultimate answer that you're asking. You do have the authority. Obviously, as cities, as municipalities, we're statutory creations, right? And we're just simply gifted that authority to be able to determine zoning. Master plan being that larger concept, I mean, I know I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but being the master concept that we tell people, this is what we want our community to look like in the future, right? This is how we want to develop. These are the general parameters. And then, zoning, those are the specific uses. There's many, many ways that this could play out, and I think you're ultimately addressing that. A developer coming in, I think, Aaron mentioned sort of the same thing. A developer coming in, most likely, there's going to be a lot of influences here. This body, council, having the master plan, speak a certain way with respect to redevelopment of this property. We anticipate that these properties are not going to be utilized in the same way going forward, right? Whether they're obsolete or whatever, the uses may not make sense. So somebody coming in may want to redevelop them. If they redevelop, do we have the authority? Answer is the short yes. You have the authority to be able to determine what your city is going to look like in the future, right? Following these legal steps that you always follow in this body and the council always follows. A developer can come in and can submit to all the usual processes they submit to in front of this body with respect to any given property. Currently zoned commercial, having some old antiquated building, but wants to tear down and develop, rezone to some, to be able to build condominiums, right? And comes before this body, requests, redetermination of zoning and submit site plan and all the steps that you take day in and day out. So the same thing will happen here. Merely because it's been utilized as a school and it's currently zoned as such, doesn't mean that we're stuck to that primer. Better, worse, same?
I will say that that's a very interesting explanation
I think
about my property. So,
But if you think about it, that's exactly what we do with all of our properties, right? Nothing unusual here. Your chairs are your chairs, and I agree, like conceptually, I agree with the absurdity of telling people what to do with their property. But what else do you do here? What else does this body do other than tell people what to do with their property? I mean, you've been doing that all along. Here, and ZBA.
Are you saying that you think that the platted land actually bears weight in terms of outweighing like what zoning in the master, it's zoned for the school, which it sounds like that outweighs the platted land.
It's zoned R2.
Well, it's zoned R2.
And
With
many plots are used to execute the school, and they have been.
Yep.
But we have had many discussions and we've had a lot of issues on the ZBA where you go back and say, I had a house and I I owned the property next door, and I always used it that way until now, and I want to build a house on that plotted land, and that's just, the fact that it's already plotted, it's already R2 for many, 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 many years. It just help us, guide us through as to how we could do something different when it has that legacy.
Sure, and I think to address your question from a different angle, part of our goal with the master plan update is to provide interesting ideas for development that could have a potentially high return on investment that might entice a developer to do something different with that property other than just use the existing plat. And that's kind of, what a lot of the ideas that were provided at the open house were about. And that's ultimately what we're going to be discussing at the next meeting is, what can we put on the table that might give Clawson something it doesn't already have that's appropriate for the area, that a developer would actually be interested in building, but either may not be able to build the way it's currently zoned right now, or may not have considered for that area because they're just looking at the surroundings and thinking, well, I'm just going to do exactly what's already here. And that discussion's gone both ways, to larger lots and also to kind of alternative approaches to single-family development. But that's the idea behind doing the master plan amendment is, let's see if we can come up with something that we'd like to see there, and then enable that to happen. And obviously, ultimately it comes down to who buys the land and how they want to develop it. But if some of the more innovative ideas aren't on the table at all, if they're not in the zoning ordinance at all, if you just can't do them, then they're not going to get done. And that's part of the reason we're doing the master plan update, is that we want to put those ideas on the table and we want to make them possible. So, that's really what it's all about. And, ultimately, the hope is that a developer will look at that and say, hey, this is a decent idea and I could get a good return on it, so I'm not going to just use the plat. I'm going to make a cottage court or something and give the city something it doesn't already have.
And I have further answer, but I'll give it to you after we're done so we don't tie up the whole board with that. But actually, I do have specific examples, not that I think about.
Sure. Thank you.
Not to the exclusion of everybody else, but just to save your time.
Okay, can we move on to agenda item number 9, the planner's report?
So I guess I'll kind of combine the planner's report and the staff report because Joan's not here. Joan did send you the monthly report. It wasn't in time for your packet, so it wasn't in the packet, but you should all have it in your email. She did want me to mention, she texted it to me. She did want me to mention, that is not the right thing. Let's see. She did want to mention that Lucky Duck down here, they were approved for a patio out front. They didn't get the platform in time, so for this year, they're going to use the sidewalk and just fence off part of the sidewalk.
Which building was that?
It's the old Moose Winooski's.
Okay.
And next year, their platform's going to go in. So if you drive by it and you see them on the sidewalk instead of on the platform as proposed, that's why. And then the other little update, we talk about it every time, 655 South Main is waiting for their photometric plan. And Joan, that was as of last Wednesday when Joan spoke to the pastor over there. So I don't know if they've received it yet, but that was the one thing that was keeping them off the agenda at that point. So we'll keep calling and reminding them to get that to us. Those are the two main things. Like I said, the report has been emailed to you. So if you have any questions or comments on that, you can always send them to Joan and me, and we will try to get you some answers.
Okay, I would have killed 9 and 10, so we have a legal update.
I'll read you. No, you're fine. Thank you. Thanks, Joe. Since we were on the topic, I just very briefly, without taking too much of your time, I'll just read you. The case was DeRuyter versus Township of Byron, the case that talked about a municipality's ability to be able to zone caregivers. And I'll just read you the paragraph. I think it's instructive with respect to the holding of the court. In the unanimous decision, the Supreme Court held that the MMA does not totally preempt a municipality's zoning authority so long as the municipality does not prohibit or penalize the cultivation of medical marijuana and does not impose regulations that are unreasonable and inconsistent with those established by state law. The Supreme Court concluded that the township zoning ordinance did not effectively prohibit the medical use of marijuana in that particular case, and thus was permitted. The court specifically stated that limiting the places where a registered and qualified caregiver could cultivate marijuana was permitted, even though the ordinance went further in that particular case as far as the regulations and the MMA was concerned. So that's where, this was in 2020 that it came. This was in 2020 that it came down. And that's why this conversation got going. So I think that's the reason. That's why we talk about this reasonableness component and staying within those reasonable limits. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody have any unfinished business or questions or where they want to go from here?
Oh, just a comment. People walking the streets, especially with babies, please look both ways for traffic. I've seen people just walk right across the street, straight arrow with the horse blinders on and not pay much attention to traffic that could be turning behind them. And people at those crosswalks with the lights, please push the buttons. The lights do work, and cars will stop.
Okay, then I'll entertain a
And a
motion.
public service announcement.
I'll entertain a motion to that we adjourn.
I'll entertain a motion that we adjourn this meeting.
I'll second that.
I have a motion and support. Roll call, please.
Mr. Sanaki?
Yes.
Mr. Watson?
Yes.
Mr. Fitzer?
Yes.
Mr. Cusero?
Yes.
Mr. McHale?
Yes.
Mr. Nushai?
Yes.
Mr. Pernick?
Yes.
And Ms. Redmond?
Yes.
Thank you, everyone.
Good seeing everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Welcome, Sam.